My father-in-law told my kids I didn't want them. I gifted her a dollhouse with hidden speakers repeating every cruel thing she's ever said. I'm 34 years old, and I've been married to Nathan, my husband, for over a decade. We have 2 kids, Lily, who's 8, and Max, who's 6. From the outside, we probably seem like a typical family. But if you dig a little deeper, there's one issue that's been poisoning my life since the day I married Nathan, his mother, Margaret. Margaret is the kind of woman who acts sweet in front of company, but has a way of making you feel small when no one's watching. She's never liked me. She doesn't say it outright, of course. Instead, she does it in little ways, comments about my parenting, digs at my career, comparisons to my sister-in-law, Susan. Susan, according to Margaret, is the perfect wife. She stays home with the kids, makes elaborate home-cooked meals, and always looks put together. Meanwhile, I work in tech. My job is demanding, and I'm not home baking cookies or attending every school event. I do my best, but according to Margaret, it's never enough. It started small. Backhanded compliments about how impressive it was that Nathan was handling things so well despite my job. Subtle remarks about how kids need their mothers at home. But over time, she got bolder. She'd make comments in front of the kids, planting doubts in their minds. It was always little things. Lily, do you think mommy will remember to pick you up on time today? Max, I used to pack the most wonderful lunches for your daddy when he was your age. It's a shame your mom is too busy to do the same. Nathan always told me to ignore her, that she was just old-fashioned and didn't mean harm. But I knew better. Margaret knew exactly what she was doing. Then, one day, she crossed a line. We were visiting her house for the weekend, something I never looked forward to but tolerated for Nathan's sake. I had stepped outside to take a work call, leaving the kids in the living room with Margaret. When I came back, I found Lily sitting on the couch, her eyes red-rimmed, and her lower lip trembling. Max looked confused, his little brows furrowed. I crouched down in front of them. What's wrong? Lily looked at me and hesitated. Then, in the smallest voice, she said, Did you only have a so daddy wouldn't leave you? The room spun for a second. I barely registered the sound of Margaret sipping her tea like nothing had happened. I glanced at Max, who was waiting for my answer like he wasn't sure what to believe. What? I managed to ask. Margaret let out a little laugh. Oh, don't look at me like that. We were just chatting. I was telling them how some women feel pressure to have babies, that's all. But I knew that wasn't all. I turned back to Lily, who told you that? She glanced at her grandmother but said nothing. Margaret smiled, like she had done nothing wrong. I stood up. My voice was sharp enough that he came into the room immediately. He took one look at my face and then at our daughter, still holding back tears. What happened? Before I could speak, Margaret chimed in. Oh, honestly, stop being so dramatic. I was just having a conversation with the kids. They misunderstood. Nathan looked at her. Then at me. I could see the moment he realized something was very, very wrong. What did you say to them? She sighed like she was the one being inconvenienced. I simply said that their mother was always so busy with work, that she never seemed like the type who wanted children. That's all. Ugh. It's the truth, isn't it? The way she said it. So casual. Like she hadn't just put a knife in my daughter's heart. I clenched my fists. Nathan's face turned red. That's not a conversation you get to have with our kids. Oh, don't be ridiculous. I'm their grandmother. I'm just being honest. I took a step closer. You don't get to decide what my children believe about me. Margaret rolled her eyes. Well, if you were around more, maybe they wouldn't have to wonder. That was it. I turned to the kids. Go get your bags. Nathan looked at me. Then at his mother. Then back at me. We're leaving, I said. Margaret scoffed. Oh, don't be silly. I apologized. No, I cut her off. You didn't. Lily and Max rushed to grab their things. And Nathan, for once, didn't try to argue. He looked at his mother like he was seeing her for the first time. Then he turned away. We packed up and left without another word. That night when we got home, I sat in the dark thinking. This wasn't just one comment. It was a pattern. Margaret had been undermining me for years. This was just the first time I had caught her red-handed. I thought about how she'd dismiss everything if I confronted her again. How she'd gaslight us into thinking it was all a misunderstanding. And then I got an idea. I had been browsing online for Christmas gifts earlier that week. One thing that had caught my eye was a customizable dollhouse. It had tiny furniture, little lights, everything a person could want in a perfect miniature home. And suddenly I knew exactly what I needed to do. I had skills. I worked in tech. I knew how to install small, discreet speakers. I knew how to record things. I knew how to play them back on command. Margaret had spent years using words as weapons. Now I was going to make sure she heard every single one of them. Margaret didn't change. Even after we walked out of her house that day, even after Nathan confronted her, she carried on as if nothing had happened. The passive-aggressive remarks didn't stop. If anything, she got smarter about them. Instead of direct attacks, she wrapped them in careful wording, making sure they sounded just vague enough that calling her out would make us look like the unreasonable ones. One afternoon, I overheard her talking to Lily while she was helping her braid her hair. "Some mothers just aren't naturally maternal," she murmured, like she was sharing a secret. "They struggled to love their kids the way a real mother should. But that doesn't mean it's your fault, sweetheart. You're still such a lovely girl." Another time, she was with Max, watching him build with his toy blocks. "You know, when your dad was your age, he was always so careful. So smart. He never needed help with anything. He just knew how to do things better than other kids." She smiled at him, her voice warm, but I saw the way Max's shoulders tensed, how his little fingers clutched the blocks tighter. Whenever Nathan or I confronted her, she played the same game. A tilt of the head, a dramatic sigh. "Oh, come on, you really think I would say something so awful? I was just making conversation. You're being too sensitive." And just like that, the conversation would turn, making us look like the ones creating problems. I stopped reacting. Instead, I focused on the plan. Every night after the kids were asleep, I worked in my office, modifying the dollhouse. The speakers were small. Hidden in the walls behind the miniature furniture, I programmed them to play recordings at intervals, quiet at first, but gradually getting louder, impossible to ignore. Finding the audio was easier than I expected. Margaret had left a trail over the years, old voice messages she had sent, nanny cam footage from when she babysat the kids, fresh recordings I made by casually keeping my phone nearby when she spoke. It was all there, the passive-aggressive remarks, the subtle jabs, the manipulation. I pieced them together, choosing the ones that would expose her the most. The timing had to be perfect. Nathan's brother and his wife, Susan, were hosting Christmas Eve dinner. It was tradition, big gathering, extended family, plenty of witnesses. The dollhouse would be the grand gift for the kids, something they would be excited about, something everyone would pay attention to. Margaret would never suspect a thing. I ran tests for days. I set up the dollhouse in my office and let the speakers play on a loop, making small adjustments to ensure everything worked seamlessly. The recordings would begin softly, almost like a whisper, then repeat, gradually growing clearer. The effect would be undeniable. Meanwhile, Margaret continued as she always did, completely unaware. She even bragged to Susan about how influential she was over the kids, claiming that I was too emotional to handle their upbringing properly. Nathan had been quiet lately, watching, listening. I could see the shift in him. Before, he had always tried to see the best in his mother. But now, every time she opened her mouth around our children, I saw the way his jaw tightened, the way he clenched his hands at his sides. He was seeing her clearly now. Margaret, on the other hand, was smug. She started bringing little gifts for the kids whenever she visited, flipping them small treats and whispering to them about how grandmothers always knew best. She was securing her influence, confident that nothing could shake it. A few days before Christmas Eve, I casually mentioned to her that I was getting a big present for the kids. I didn't say what it was, just that it was something special. She barely hesitated before asking if it was age-appropriate and if I was sure it was a good idea. She never missed an opportunity to imply I didn't know what I was doing as a parent. I smiled and assured her it would be perfect. The final test run went flawlessly. The speakers activated on cue. The recordings played in sequence and the timing was just right. When the dollhouse was placed in a room full of people, there would be no way for Margaret to deny what came next. Christmas Eve arrived. Nathan and I arrived at his brother's house with the kids. The dollhouse carefully wrapped and waiting in the car. Margaret greeted us with her usual exaggerated warmth, hugging Lily and Max just a little too long, making a point to ignore me until she had no choice but to acknowledge my presence. I smiled at her like nothing was wrong. Dinner was exactly what I expected. Margaret chatting animatedly with Susan, making sly remarks whenever the conversation turned to me and pretending not to notice when Nathan cut her off. But I didn't react, I waited. After dinner, it was time for presents. The kids tore through their gifts, excited squeals filling the room. Then came the dollhouse. Lily's eyes lit up the second she saw it. Max clapped his hands, already reaching to open it. Margaret beamed. "Oh, what a lovely little home. Isn't it wonderful how some mothers show love through gifts when they can't always be present?" I kept my expression neutral. The kids settled in front of the dollhouse, playing with the miniature furniture, their tiny hands moving pieces around. The room buzzed with conversation, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Then the first whisper, soft. Almost too quiet to notice. Margaret didn't react, no one did. A few seconds passed and the whisper came again, clearer this time. Lily paused, glancing up. Another pause. Then the next line. Margaret's own voice, laced with the same condescending sweetness she always used. Some mothers just aren't naturally maternal. They struggled to love their kids the way a real mother should. The chatter in the room dimmed. Susan turned her head slightly frowning. A few seconds later, another recording played. You know, when your dad was your age, he was always so careful. So smart. He just knew how to do things better than other kids. Margaret stiffened. The whispers continued, growing louder. Snippets of her own words, her own voice, echoing from the tiny house in the middle of the room. Margaret's face went pale. The conversations had stopped now. Everyone was looking at the dollhouse, at her. I didn't say a word. I just watched as realization set in. She wasn't getting out of this one. The room was silent. Margaret's voice echoed through the air, soft at first, like a whisper from nowhere. Mothers like yours always regret having kids. The laughter and conversation around the dinner table faded. A few people glanced around, confused. Nathan's brother frowned and asked if someone left the TV on. Margaret was frozen, her hand hovering over her plate. Lily, still sitting on the floor beside the dollhouse, looked up, her little brows furrowed. Max's fingers curled around one of the tiny furniture pieces inside, holding it too tightly. A few moments passed. The chatter slowly picked up again, though quieter this time. Some assumed they had misheard. Others, like Nathan, were already watching. Then, the second voice played, clearer, louder. Your mother only had you to keep your father around. The room shifted. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Forks paused midway to mouths. Margaret's head snapped toward the dollhouse. The voice was unmistakable. It was hers. She blinked rapidly, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. Her hands, resting on the tablecloth, trembled just enough for me to notice. Susan turned to her husband. Did you hear that? Nathan was already staring at Margaret, his knuckles white against his glass. Margaret forced a breathy laugh, shaking her head. What a strange malfunction. What is this, some kind of toy with preloaded phrases? She turned to me, her expression carefully controlled. Where did you buy this? I didn't answer. No one else spoke either. The third playback hit harder than the last two. The voice had been recorded only days before, still dripping with that signature fake warmth Margaret used when she wanted to plant seeds of doubt. She barely spends time with you. I bet she wishes she never had kids. Lily's face fell. Her hands dropped to her lap, fingers twisting together as if trying to process what she had just heard. Max turned his head toward me. His little voice broke the silence. Mom, Margaret shot up from her seat, eyes darting around. All right, enough, this is ridiculous. She turned sharply to Nathan. Turn it off, someone's playing a joke. Nathan didn't move. She turned to his brother next. This is absurd. Some glitch, some sick, another snippet played, cutting her off. You're lucky I'm here to teach you how a real mother should act. Nathan stood. His chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharpened the silence. How many times? His voice was low, steady. Margaret blinked at him, still trying to maintain control. How many times have you said things like this to our kids? His fists were clenched at his sides. How much have you been whispering in their ears behind our backs? Susan exhaled sharply, exchanging a quick glance with her husband. The mood in the room had shifted from confusion to something heavier. Margaret let out a shaky laugh, raising her hands. You're all being ridiculous. It's just some technical issue or maybe someone is messing with. I cut her off. Margaret's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The room was thick with tension. Nathan's brother leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Mom, his voice was quiet but firm. Tell me she's lying. Margaret's eyes darted to him, then to Susan, then back to Nathan. She let out a huff, trying to regain control. This is ridiculous. She snapped, the sugary tone gone. You all know I would never. Nathan's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists. You've been doing this for years, haven't you? His voice was low, controlled, but there was no mistaking the anger underneath. How many times have you told them things like this? You sat there, he continued, his voice cold, and you tried to turn our kids against their own mother. His breathing was heavy, his face unreadable. You told them their mother didn't love them. You made Lily cry, you made Max doubt himself. And for what? So you could feel superior? Susan shook her head, staring at Margaret like she was seeing her for the first time. I didn't, Margaret started. Lily spoke then, you did. Her voice was small, but the effect was instant. Margaret turned to her, the denial still on her face, but Lily wasn't looking at her. She was looking at me. You said those things. Lily whispered, her eyes welling with tears. You said them to us. Margaret paled. Sweetheart, you misunderstood. Max spoke next. Did you mean it? His little hands clutched the fabric of his pants. Did you mean it when you said Mommy didn't want us? Margaret's face crumbled. Of course not, I love you both so much. I was just, Nathan cut her off. Get out, Margaret froze. What, you heard me. She let out a shaky breath. Nathan, be reasonable. This is our family, you're not my family if you hurt my kids. He shot back. Nathan's brother stood. You should go. Margaret's face twisted, like she was about to argue, but then she saw the way everyone was looking at her. Susan, Nathan, the kids. She turned to me, her lips curling. You did this. I didn't respond. She let out a sharp breath and grabbed her purse. Her movements jerky. Signed, she spat. Her composure finally cracking. If this is how you all treat me after everything I've done for this family, then I won't waste another second here. She stormed toward the door. No one stopped her. The front door slammed. For a moment, the only sound in the house was the faint crackling of the fireplace. Max shifted closer to me, his small body pressing against my side. Lily crawled onto my lap without a word. Nathan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. This ends tonight. Margaret shot up from her chair, her movements jerky and frantic. The color had drained from her face, but her mouth was already moving. Her voice sharp and panicked. This is a setup. Her hands trembled as she pointed around the room, accusing eyes landing on me first, then shifting to Nathan. Someone tampered with that thing. This isn't real. You all know I would never. The words cut off as another recording played. You're lucky I'm here to teach you how a real mother should act. Nathan slammed his glass down on the table so hard it cracked. Margaret flinched. Stop. His voice was sharp, clipped. He pushed his chair back and stood. Fists clenched at his sides. Just stop. She blinked up at him, still shaking. Nathan, please, you can't actually believe. Nathan took a step forward. I heard you. My kids heard you. Do you think we're all stupid? That we just imagined it? That this is some kind of trick? Margaret's mouth opened, then closed again. Lily let out a small sob, wiping at her face with the sleeve of her dress. Her little shoulders shook as she sniffled.